From the National Archives and Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., the American Enterprise Institute presents another in its series of distinguished lectures on the American Bicentennial. What is past is prologue, reads a motto carved outside the National Archives building. And another motto there tells us that the heritage of the past is the seed that brings forth the harvest of the future. Thus, the National Archives is a fitting place to preface tonight's AEI lecture, which is entitled The American Revolution and the Future. The lecture will be delivered by former Secretary of State Dean Rusk. Enshrined in the main exhibition hall of the Archives are the three great charters of American freedom: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Extreme measures have been taken to ensure the safety of these historic documents. Directly beneath the shrine at which the documents are displayed is a 20-foot-deep bomb-proof and fireproof vault. The vault is made of steel and reinforced concrete with floors, walls, and a lid, each 15 inches thick. An electrically operated device can lower the documents into the vault in about 1 minute. A backup mechanism will lower the documents in case of power failure. The shrine is located in the center of the building so that additional protection is afforded by the masonry walls of the Archives. The United States was the last major country to provide for adequate storage of its historical records. France built its National Archives in 1790, and England followed in 1838. The National Archives in Washington was not completed until 1937, and some of our most important historical documents were kept for up to 150 years in boxes stored in cellars, attics, and old garages. When they were finally transferred here, the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights had begun to deteriorate to a serious degree. To prevent further damage, each of the pieces of parchment on which the documents are written is now stored in a separate case made of bronze and thermopane glass. The cases are filled with helium and a small amount of water vapor. Dust, moisture, mold, and other contaminants are effectively excluded. The treatment of these documents today is quite a contrast with the way they were handled during the War of 1812. When the British advanced toward Washington, the three documents were stuffed into coarse linen sacks and carried on horse carts across the Potomac to Leesburg, Virginia, where they were safely hidden. During World War II, they were stored for protection with our gold supply at Fort Knox. Another great document preserved in the National Archives is President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Issued during the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation declared that all slaves living in Confederate territory were free men. Less than 3 years later, Abraham Lincoln would be dead, the victim of an assassin's bullet here at Ford's Theater. The theater is now restored to the way it was at the time of Lincoln's death and is once again in general use after a century of idleness as a theater. It is here that today's AEI distinguished lecturer, Dean Rusk, will deliver his address on the American Revolution and the future. Mr. Rusk is being introduced by the president of the American Enterprise Institute, Mr. William J. Baroody.
It is our sincere hope that these lectures may contribute in some measure to setting the stage and the tone for a meaningful and fruitful celebration of the nation's 200th anniversary. We are most hopeful that this effort may help in charting national approaches that will permit the people of the third American century to achieve the good society toward which we all aspire. Our speaker tonight, the Honorable Dean Rusk, is now serving as professor in the School of Law at the University of Georgia. Peering into an uncertain future is nothing new for Dean Rusk. For more than 20 years, he participated, both as public official and private citizen, in decisions which have profoundly shaped the lives of everyone in this room, of all Americans, and of hundreds of millions beyond our shores. From 1952 to 1960, he was president of the Rockefeller Foundation. As Secretary of State serving under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, he was a senior policymaker in such major international events as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the negotiation of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the development of NATO policy, and the Vietnam War. Since his retirement from government service in 1969, Secretary Rusk has been Sibley Professor of International Law in the School of Law at the University of Georgia, where he is working with younger generations of Americans, helping to prepare them for the future he will discuss with us this evening. His topic tonight, the American Revolution and the Future. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Dean Rusk.
Your Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished guests, and many old friends whom I see here, Mr. Baroudi, thank you very much, sir, for your generous introduction. Now that I'm happily dropping out of the public eye, I don't take introductions for granted anymore. Just before inauguration in January 1969, I was asked by a friend in the press corps what my most immediate ambition would be upon leaving office. I said to produce some news stories as quickly as possible, asking, whatever happened to that fellow? I have been making some progress in that direction. Some time ago, a man came up to me in the Atlanta airport and said, "Aren't you John Foster Dulles?" I could only reply, well, if I am, there's been quite a miracle. Although I have usually declined invitations to come to this particular city to make speeches because I've already said far too much in this place, I was greatly complimented by the invitation of the American Enterprise Institute to come here to Ford's Theater, a place hallowed by the life and death of one of our greatest Americans, to talk about the American Revolution and its meaning for the future. One's first reaction was to wonder whether this is the time to address such matters, whether the sense of dismay and concern would make words about first principles sound hollow, whether cynicism might take over, whether it might be better to wait. But further reflection suggests that it is in just such a time that we need to remind ourselves of some rather elementary and simple guidelines to find our way through the fog of confusion and to reestablish our sense of direction. One example. Where are the voices which are saying to the American people at this point that 99+% of the men and women in government, executive, legislative, and judicial branches, federal, state, and local governments are honest, decent men and women trying to do a good job? Are we, by silence or by innuendo, allowing tens of millions of the members of a major political party in this country to bear the malefactions of some 24 people, however highly placed some of them might have been? Are incumbents, whatever the party, feeling the backlash of recent events without regard to their own guilt or innocence in the premises? Surely there are certain elements of fairness and justice which we can draw upon to check some of the extravagances of our period whatever our dismay might be at some of the things which have happened. What should we say about the future? One who attempts to talk about the future must be respectful of the pervasive fog which hides much of it from our view. Those who are accustomed to the fact that most foreign policy decisions are about the future will know that there is no way to describe in detail what life will be like in the year 2000. Indeed, life in the American colonies was much nearer the life of the Greek city-states than that of 20th century America. And historical literature is filled with prophecies gone wrong. For example, that if trains should move at more than 40 miles an hour, the blood vessels of all persons on board would burst because the human body could not stand such speed. Or that the introduction of bathtubs would bring pestilence upon the land. It is possible, however, to identify some major issues which must be our preoccupation between now and the year 2000. Some different in kind than any the human race has ever faced before. Some likely to impose the severest strains upon all existing political systems as necessary adjustments are made. And some requiring a relatively definitive solution rather soon if the human race itself is to survive. Nostalgia for simpler and more leisurely days offers us no escape from the continuing and breathtaking acceleration in the pace of change, and no relief from the ever-growing complexity of individual, national, and international life. A very wise man, General Omar Bradley, said a number of years ago that the time has come to chart our course by the distant stars and not by the lights of each passing ship. Which are the ideas which can give us our compass bearings amidst the tumult of change? We would do no honor to Thomas Jefferson and his extraordinary colleagues of the Continental Congress were we to celebrate our bicentennial by a ritual incantation of a few words, with bands playing and flags flying. What do those ideas mean today? Where are the universal men and the universal women, people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, to help us see things as a whole and derive from the masses of specialized knowledge those insights and flashes of wisdom so vital to the dignity and freedom of man? One can retain a profound respect for the value of scholarly research in the traditional sense and still hope that our universities would do somewhat more to find a way to discover and nourish more Jeffersons, more de Tocquevilles, more Lord Bryces. But let us pause at this point to remind ourselves of a few of the problems which will be with us for the decades just ahead. The overriding concern must be the organization of a durable peace. The fact that men have fought each other since the dawn of human history leads many to suppose that war among nations is inevitable, rooted in the very nature of man. But most of us in this room have been witnesses to a profound change in the nature of the problem. The appearance in frail human hands of thousands of megatons, which could, if fired, bring into question the capacity of the earth itself to sustain human life. My generation of young people were led into the catastrophe of a world war which could have been prevented. We came out of it with a deep commitment to the notion of collective security, written into Article 1 of the United Nations Charter, and later reinforced by mutual security treaties. But we must be honest and recognize that the notion of collective security is steadily eroding, perhaps particularly in this country. And one can understand that because it has cost us dearly in the lives of our young men and in very large economic burdens to try to sustain a little peace here and there and another place in different parts of the world. And it hasn't been all that collective. We put up 90% of the non-Korean forces in Korea, 80% of the non-Vietnamese forces in Vietnam. And so I can understand those who say that if this is what collective security means, maybe it is not a very good idea. I am concerned, however, that there is not enough public discussion to the point of what, if not, collective security. To this question, each generation must find its own answer. I myself do not attempt to advise young people of today what their answers to that question shall be, because they are for them to find out for themselves. Their answer may not be as simple as collective security. It may be far more complicated, like a bundle of sticks, no one of which enough to do the job, but which altogether might get it accomplished. I have suggested to some of my young friends that they would not improve their situation very much if they simply reject the mistakes of their fathers in order to embrace the mistakes of their grandfathers. But they have some important assets on which to build. In 2 months' time, we shall be passing by the 29th year since a nuclear weapon has been fired in anger. A very important statement to be able to say when one looks back upon the grievous crises through which we have come since 1945. And one can report in complete honesty that the overwhelming majority of international frontiers are peaceful. The overwhelming majority of treaties are complied with. The overwhelming majority of disputes are settled by peaceful means. If that is not your impression, it is partly because there is a vast context of habitual and regular international cooperation which goes on every day throughout the year, which fails to come to your attention not because it's secret, but because it cannot compete for space in view of the extraordinarily difficult problem which our news media have in deciding how to allocate the limited space and time at their disposal. But that search for peace must continue, probing every possibility for agreement before problems rise to the point of violence. Emphasis upon prevention, reducing problems one at a time, large or small, to the dimensions of manageability. One thinks of the environment. We've learned in recent years that man himself apparently can inflict irreparable damage upon this thin skin around the surface of the earth, which we call the atmosphere, a few inches of topsoil, a little water, something new. Here I'm relatively optimistic because I believe here we have a chance to take up this problem while it is merely serious before it becomes disastrous. Now, what do these problems have to do with Thomas Jefferson? With the Continental Congress and the Declaration of Independence. They lived before railways or ocean liners or automobiles, airplanes, radio, television, E equals MC squared, and men driving jeeps around the moon. But the men of the Continental Congress were heirs to a more than 2,000-year-old discourse on the political consequences of the nature of man. We are indebted to the late Cornell professor, my friend Clinton Rossiter, who described this heritage brilliantly in his Seed Time of the Republic, a book which should be widely read and reread during the bicentennial season. Thomas Jefferson did not claim that he and his fellows created the ideas we find in the Declaration. What he did do was to articulate in elegant simplicity, in little more than 200 words, in the opening portion of the Declaration, ideas which represented a broad consensus of the men of his time, which were well suited to the purposes which they had in mind, and which were cast in universal terms. My own view is that the notion that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed remains the most powerful and revolutionary political idea in the world today. Tyrants live in terror of this simple notion, and sometimes take the most extraordinary means to ensure that their people are not infected by this virus of freedom. This notion of constitutional limits upon the use of raw power is utterly fundamental to the notion of liberty under law. And its steady growth over the centuries makes up a very exciting story. To know that all the king's horses and all the king's men cannot do X and Y and Z to a simple private citizen. With a little bit of analytical license, to transform the notion that the king can do no wrong into the notion that if it is wrong, the king cannot be permitted to do it. Many elements in the building of that notion, including some old English judges who, at the risk of their own lives, put their arms around the prisoners at the bar and said to the king, "You cannot do this to this man." But the men of the Continental Congress were men of their times, aware of the limits of the possible, perhaps more concerned about unity and a demand for independence than about giving reality to all of the implied promises of unalienable rights. And on this point, after a rather shameful delay, the revolution continues. Giant strides by the courts in the 1950s, by presidents and Congress in the 1960s, and much unfinished business still before us. Perhaps not so much now in terms of the law as in terms of what you and I think about these matters in our own personal and daily lives. This notion of unalienable rights is reinforced by what is called a right of revolution, because Thomas Jefferson did indeed mention that in a rather conservative fashion, because he made it clear that prudence would dictate that we do not change governments for light or transient causes. Perhaps it is not a right but a power, but it is always there. Because at the end of the day, you cannot force a few free people. They can be led, they can be persuaded, they cannot be forced. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind, here another major transformation. Thomas Jefferson put the opinions of mankind in the plural. I wish we would do more of that today, because we keep talking about world public opinion. And I don't know what that is. Occasionally, when the United Nations General Assembly is virtually unanimous, one might speak of world public opinion. But if they vote in terms of less than 10% of the world's population casting 2/3 of the vote in the Assembly, one must think about it. But this notion of a decent respect to the opinions of mankind has made a big difference to American policy over the decades. The way we conducted ourselves at the end of World War II, in demobilizing perhaps too unwisely but very fast, in putting nuclear materials at the disposal of the United Nations in the Baruch Plan, unhappily rejected, by mobilizing large resources to bind up the wounds of war, by accepting and encouraging so many of the newly independent nations to come into the United Nations, and mobilizing even more massive resources to help them with their economic and social development. There have been mistakes, frustrations, disappointments, but if our friends from other countries here will forgive perhaps a little touch of pretense, the broad sweep of American policy since 1945 has been a story of restraint and responsibility, and perhaps even a touch of generosity. But there's now a difference, because perhaps contrary to the daily lives of those in the Continental Congress, our present national problems cannot be solved except through a large amount of international action. Whether we're talking about peace or the environment or raw materials, productivity, energy, inflation, trade, food, the encouragement of science and learning. There is no way to solve them in an isolated America or in an isolated Western Hemisphere. And so one can be concerned about a mood of withdrawal from world affairs, which one senses in this country these days, and can wonder how long that will last before we take up again some of these great tasks, which are our own problems, which demand international action. I must say I see coming into being something which can, in due course, be called a family of man. Not world government. A family of man not based upon sentiments of brotherhood. Those are not deep enough or strong enough to bring about that result. But out of sheer necessity, and harsh necessity is a very persuasive teacher. I must say I am profoundly optimistic about the long run. Perhaps that is an article of faith, because I cannot debate it with those who disagree. But I believe that mankind can be rational at the end of the day, even if in the early morning we all are pretty ridiculous. Some of our problems are threatening to outstrip the capacity of the mind of man. But one recalls John F. Kennedy's remark that problems created by man can be solved by man. Whether one believes that or not, is there any choice but to try? And it will require hard work, wisdom, restraint, sacrifice, a great many things. In this 200th year of the Declaration, we should not be unduly ashamed to say to ourselves that the American people, at their best, are a very good people. How to call forth our best is not only for political leaders, but for our homes and churches and schools and universities, the news media, all of us who communicate with each other. But most important of all, for each one of us sovereign citizens in the impenetrable reflections of our inmost thoughts. Self-criticism and what the poet called divine discontent have achieved miracles. But excessive self-flagellation can be self-destructive. We could note in the Continental Congress a group of men who dared to build upon hope and confidence, not fear and disunity. And as we continue with the tasks which face us over the next 3 decades, we shall find other times, other issues, other gleaming moments when we can come together and pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Thank you very much.
From the National Archives and Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., this has been another in the American Enterprise Institute's distinguished lecture series on the American Bicentennial. If you wish a copy of this lecture or of the entire series, write the American Enterprise Institute. That's AEI, Post Office Box 19191, Washington, D.C. 20036. Each single lecture is $1. The book containing the entire series is $12. Special educational rates are available.